Well, America's ever-spiraling COVID death toll has cast a shadow over Joe Biden's first year in office. But the president is now claiming that any solution to the crisis will have to come from individual states and not from the White House.
There is no federal solution. This gets solved at a state level, and it ultimately gets down to where the rubber meets the road, and that's where the patient is in need of help or preventing the need for help.
Joe Biden's remarks run counter to his views before he took office. Just over a year ago, he slammed the Trump administration's COVID testing efforts as a travesty and said the administration's vaccine rollout was well behind other developed nations. As presidential contender, Biden promised to change the course of the disease in his first 100 days in office. But that does not seem to have happened. More than 400,000 Americans have died of COVID under Biden's watch. That is more than under Trump. And new cases are hovering at around 500,000 per day. New York has been the worst hit, with case numbers reaching an all-time record since the arrival of Omicron. Testing there is also in chaos, it seems, with huge lines forming outside overloaded clinics. What I want to bring in now, Spike Cohen, 2020 vice presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party, Justin Robert Young, host of the Politics podcast, and Bob Djavan, a medical professor. Spike, I want to start with you. Biden said, word for word, there is no federal solution. I don't think that is something that one wants to hear from the president. So he says it's up to the states to solve the pandemic. What is that? Is that him accepting that the White House can't do it, or is it him shifting responsibility?
Well, it is him shifting responsibility, but honestly, it's also Biden's rhetoric catching up with the reality, which is that there never was a federal solution to a virus that spreads more easily than chickenpox. And with each new variant, as it becomes more and more virulent, the idea that there's some policy or some politician or some restriction that's going to stop it, we should have been acknowledging that this is not a pandemic and that this is endemic at least a couple of waves ago. COVID waves aren't going away. At this point, we should have been applying what we should have applied from the beginning. If you don't feel well, stay home. And if you do feel well, then take whatever precautions you feel are best necessary to be able to take care of them. The most restrictive countries and states are seeing, very high record numbers in each wave. And the ones with the least restrictive are also seeing record high numbers. It really doesn't matter what kind of policies are happening. This is a very, very virulent virus. Thankfully, it looks like it's becoming more mild, and there's not a government solution to this.
Justin, I want to bring you in. I mean, like I said, Biden promised to change the course of the pandemic. 100 days. We know that those 100 days are now gone. He's been in power for almost a year. What marks do you give him? Did he turn it around?
No, I would give him bad marks if you were to ask me what marks I would give him. But then again, I think that Spike makes a point. There is only so much that you can contain a biblical flood. You can argue that the government should have sent you more nails to put boards on the door. But at the end of the day, we're all going to end up in the river. And that's exactly what has happened. I do think that it is very interesting that Joe Biden has made a big, I mean, look, by the numbers, Joe Biden got elected because of Donald Trump's failed handling of COVID in the minds of voters. That was the number one issue that people had when they went into the ballot box in 2020. The economy was number two. Now we are coming into, a year after he was elected and coming up on the year that he was inaugurated. And we have COVID as bad as it's been, certainly case wise, although you can make an argument that Omicron is actually good news in terms of the epidemiology. But the economy is in far worse shape than he has been. So I think that by and large, we can now add up all the rough weeks for Biden to rough year for Biden.
Bob, I want to ask you, obviously, as someone with medical experience, 62% of Americans are now double jabbed. They said that when we get to a certain threshold, everything's going to be great. There's herd immunity. We're going to be able to live more normally. In your opinion, is 62% good enough?
I think it's terrible. I mean, 62% is close to 50% and not close to 100%. But frankly speaking, in Europe, we're not doing much better. Western Europe has roughly a double jab rate of 70%. Austria, where I'm from, is around 73, 74%. Now, most of the people are getting their third booster jab, but unfortunately, even in the Western so-called really advanced world, economically and industrially, we are far behind from what we should be.
We're going to get actually to reasons behind that. Actually, no, Spike, I'll ask you right now. I mean, talking about being behind the levels that we are, the US does have fairly high levels of vaccine hesitancy, as it's known. At least 21%, I believe, of adults don't want the vaccines. What do you think is the cause for that? Is it lack of trust in the government?
First of all, let me tell you something.
Oh, Spike, let's go to you, and then Bob, I'll come back to you. Spike, go for it.
Okay. Yeah, there's definitely a lack of trust in the government as well as a lack of trust in big pharmaceutical companies. It's also the fact that, and this is something that it's odd that we're not acknowledging this. According to the South African study that came out about the vaccine effectiveness for the Omicron variant, they said it was as effective as 33%. That means it is 66% ineffective in stopping or slowing someone from getting or spreading COVID. Now, it had higher numbers of keeping people out of getting severe illness or ending up in the hospital. But, you know, the argument that you have to get vaccinated or else you're putting people at risk, that is becoming less and less true with each new variant. And when people are watching a government say you're a bad person if you don't do this, despite all evidence to the contrary, yes, that makes people skeptical and hesitant. The fact that Pfizer is saying that they don't want to release the safety data for their for the trials for their vaccine for 50 years, you know, all of these things add up to people becoming hesitant. And to be clear, I'm not anti-vax. I think that if you think it's the best choice for you, then you should get it. But the lack of data supporting the idea that vaccines are going to get us out of this, coupled with the threats and the attempt to try to stigmatize people that are hesitant to the vaccine, that amounts to more and more people saying, you know what, I'm wondering if I want to do this, especially now that an increasing number of so-called fully vaccinated Americans are being told, no, if you haven't had a booster shot, you're not vaccinated anymore, making you as bad as all those people that didn't get vaccinated. So I think this is only going to get worse.
Justin, you mentioned there that the economy was one of the things that obviously was at the top of people's minds when they were voting. I mean, obviously, the whole world is having a tough time coming out of COVID. No one particularly is economically in the strongest place. But the US, I mean, the inflation has been grabbing headlines all over the world. And people are now pointing the finger at Biden saying, yeah, OK, everyone's got it tough. But it didn't help that you were going on this $2 trillion stimulus package spending spree. Do you think that the Biden administration has gone a bit too far? It misjudged the situation?
Optically, obviously, they have in terms of how the public perception is. Look, inflation is a presidency killer, period. Like, in terms of political history here in America, there are few things that kill a presidency faster than having the price of average goods go up. So everybody, regardless of class and race and demographic, all have to pay a larger price. The only way out of inflation is also something that nobody really wants to think about, which are recessions or raising rates so you can slow elements of consumption. This is a bad news sandwich for Joe Biden economically, just bar none.
Bob, bringing back to sort of the medical side of it, obviously we were just talking about how the cases are still going up. In Europe, you yourself mentioned the vaccine levels aren't great there either. And the year seems to have showed that some people are getting richer and richer and others are getting poorer and poorer. Now, one industry that's done incredibly well, as usual, Big Pharma, really cashing in. I was just looking, profits, Pfizer, $82 billion expected this year. That's double last year. Do you see these medical companies making that much money as a problem?
Well, frankly, let me put the record straight because it was mentioned before, and I see still my position on a very medical, scientific point. A vaccination does not prevent you from getting infected. Let's put that on the table. This is a completely misconception that you think if you have a vaccine, the virus will just stop at your body and say, well, I'm not going there. Absolutely not. The virus will enter your body, but the vaccine will prevent that virus from causing more damage, a lot of damage, putting you into a hospital, or even having you die. So at the end of the day, don't get me wrong, but the vaccine will not, even with the Omicron, vaccines do help. So that's fact. So please, let's put the science and let the science make that decision and not just commentators. Number two, Omicron is a variant, but we understand that the virus can go two ways, getting worse or getting better. getting better is a good thing, but it will mean that it takes longer, because the worse the virus gets, the quicker it will end. Now, this gets better, which means it takes longer, but it's a good thing, as you earlier said, in terms of epidemiology. Point is that, of course, the companies who produce those vaccines did make a lot of money. There's no doubt about it. And we live in a system where if you do something good, if you produce something good, you will make money. So as a scientist, as long as those companies invest in research, in R&D, and are able to provide the amount of vaccines fairly to the whole world as we require and need it, I'm happy if somebody makes money on it. I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem, however, when in politics and politicians misuse this for their own agenda. Understand, the reason why we are not vaccinated, as was mentioned by I think Spike earlier, is because people are misinformed. There was not accurate information about these vaccines, and the fake news that are allowed on social media, let's get straight, they're allowed on social media, basically lead to the fact that patients and people at the end of the day will doubt on the necessity of having a vaccine. So let's put it where it is. These vaccines do work. If companies make money on it, fine with me, as long as they offer us the vaccines that will help. We need to inform, and politicians, that's their first duty, is not only the GDP and inflation and everything, but basically save the health of their countrymen. And this needs to be done. This was not done. We allowed fake news. Politicians, even in my country, used vaccines and vaccinations and in COVID for their own political purposes. This is dirty. This is really bad. So this is much worse than some people becoming billionaires because they produce the vaccines and make money on it.
Spike, I want to get specifically back to this idea of shifting from federal to state. I mean, because you were talking there about the polarization, or rather the hounding of people who are considered anti-vaxxers, and the split that we're seeing in society. Do you think that there is too much disagreement between the states at the moment for us to see any real change across the US? Because for example, you've got Florida, which is kind of quite laissez-faire attitude towards it. DeSantis is pretty clear-cut that he doesn't want what he says infringe on anyone's liberties. Then you've got California, which is pretty hard lines. But Spike, what's your take on that?
Well, first of all, I want to address two things that were talked about before. The way that we're going to get out of this inflation is to stop inflationary spending and to stop the U.S. and other central banks printing out trillions of dollars of their various fiat currencies, handing them off to the big businesses who put their politicians in office, and then sticking the rest of us with the bill for it. That's how we end that. When it comes to the vaccine, the most powerful misinformation we have had has come from the policymakers and the big pharma companies who initially told us that this vaccine would, in fact, stop or greatly slow the spread of COVID. Not just that it would keep us from getting sick or from dying, but that, in fact, we had to take it even if we didn't think that we'd get seriously ill, because it would protect others from getting it from us, which is clearly not the case. So, yes, misinformation was a big problem here. Now, going to your question, I think that the bigger question to the bigger answer to whether or not this is a lack of unity is that we need to acknowledge that this is not something that we're going to centrally plan our way out of at the federal level or at the state level. This is about the fact that a virus that I think it was one of the other guests who said, you can't stop Noah's flood. You're not going to be able to stop a virus that spreads more easily than chickenpox by telling people to stay home on varying weeks or to put up other restrictions of occupancy restrictions, or telling people that they need to wear a mask from when they walk into the building until they sit down, then they can take it back off. None of this stuff is going to stop this virus. And I think the sooner that we get over the conditioning that we have, that government is going to fix this, which is what we're told about crisis after crisis after crisis. Again, all evidence to the contrary. The sooner we get over that, and the sooner we recognize this is a new normal, we need to be making decisions for ourselves. We should not be listening to politicians, and we should not be listening to crony corporations, and we should be deciding for ourselves the best way out of this. The sooner we're going to be able to find the best equilibrium that we're going to have in this new reality that we have.
Finally, Justin, what I want to ask you is, Spike was just talking about the policymakers. I mean, Dr. Anthony Fauci, a very controversial figure in the US. Some hail him as a hero. Others think that he is a bit of a fearmonger. Whatever you think about him, he has recently suggested the US should consider a vaccine mandate for domestic air travel. Do you think that's the direction that we're going in? And how do you think Americans would receive that?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was about to bring it up even if you didn't. One follow up on the conversation that we had that has been talked about is the fact that we have seen less evidence that the vaccine limits transmissibility. If you don't have that part of the puzzle from a political messaging and lawmaking perspective, then you don't have the pretense to set up the mandates. You don't have a pretext to set up what Dr. Fauci and many others in the government have floated over the past few weeks, if not months, the idea that you would have to be vaccinated to get on domestic air travel. If it does not stop transmissibility, which I was very glad to hear that the other guests on the panel make that point, because I wish we had that kind of medical clarity here in a lot of the conversations that we've had, especially around the mandates. The vaccines are for your personal protection. I am triple vaxxed at this point. I am on board, and I'm very glad that I am, because I know that if I get this highly transmissible virus, it will be less than what it would be otherwise, which some of my unvaccinated friends have gotten. But yes, I don't think that that would be popular at all whatsoever.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but all three of you, thank you so much. Spike, Cohen, Justin, Robert Young, and Bob Djavan. Good to have you on.
Thank you.